Harry had never been a part of a stranger group. Crookshanks led the way down the stairs. Lupin, Pettigrew, and Ron went next, looking like entrants in a six-legged race. Next came Professor Snape, drifting creepily along, his toes hitting each stair as he descended, held up by his own wand, which was being pointed at him by Service. Harry and Hermione brought up the rear. Getting back into the tunnel was difficult. Lupin, Pettigrew, Ron had to turn sideways to manage it. Lupin had still had Pettigrew covered with his hands. Harry could see them edging awkwardly towards the tunnel in single file. Crookshanks was still in the lead, and Harry went right after Service, who was still making Snape drift along ahead of them, but kept bumping his lolling head on the low ceiling. Harry had the impression Service was making no effort to prevent this. You know what this means, Sarah said abruptly to Harry, as they made their slow progress to the tunnel. Turning Pettigrew in. You're free, said Harry. Yes, said Sirius, but I'm also... I don't know if anyone's told you, but I'm your godfather. Yeah, I know that, said Harry. Well, your parents appointed me as your guardian, said Service stiffly. If anything happened to them... Harry waited. Did Sirius mean he was thought what he meant? I'll understand, of course, if you want to stay with your aunt and uncle, said Sirius, but, well, think about it. Once my name's cleared, if you wanted a different home... Some sort of explosion took place in the pit of Harry's stomach. What? Live with you? He said, accidentally cracking his head on a bit of rock protruding from the ceiling. Leave the Dursleys? On a bit of leave the Dursleys? Of course, I thought you wouldn't want to, said Sirius quickly. No, I understand. I just thought I'd... Are you insane? Said Harry's voice easily as croaky as Sirius's. Of course I want to leave the Dursleys' house. Have you got a house? When I can move in? When can I move in? Sirius turned right around to look at him. Snape's head was scraping the ceiling, but Sirius didn't seem to care. You want to? He added. You mean it? Yeah, I mean it, said Harry. Sirius's gaunt face broke into a first true smile Harry had seen upon it. The difference it made was startling, as though a person 10 years younger were shining through that starved mask. For a moment, he was recognizable as the man who had laughed at Harry's parents' wedding. They did not speak again until they had reached the end of the tunnel. Crookshanks started up first. He had eventually pressed his paw on the knot of the trunk, because Lupin, Pettigrew, and Ron clambered upward without any sound of savaging branches. Sirius saw Snape up through the hole and then stood back for Harry and Hermione to pass. At last, all of them were out. The grounds were very dark now, and only light came onto the distant windows of the castle. Without a word, they were off. Pettigrew was still wheezing, occasionally whimpering. Harry's mind was buzzing. He was going to leave the Dursleys. He was going to live with Sirius Black, his parents' best friend. He felt dazed. What would happen when he told the Dursleys he was going to live with a convict they'd seen on television? One wrong move, Peter, said Lupin, threatened again. His wand was still pointed sideways at Pettigrew's chest. Silently, they tramped through the grounds to the castle lights, growing slowly larger. Snape was still drifting weirdly ahead, Sirius, his chin bumping on his chest, and then a cloud shifted. There were suddenly dim shadows on the ground. The party was being bathed in moonlight. Snape collided with Lupin, Pettigrew, and Ron. They stopped abruptly. Sirius froze. He flung out one arm to make Harry and Hermione stop. Harry could see the Lupin silhouette. He had gone rigid. Then his limbs began to shake. "Oh my," said Hermione gasped. "He didn't take his potion tonight. He's not safe." "Run!" Sirius whispered. "Run now!" But Harry couldn't run. Harry was chained to Pettigrew. Harry couldn't run. Ron was chained to Pettigrew, and Lupin, well, he leapt forward, but Sirius caught him around the chest and threw him back. "Leave it to me! Run!" There was a terrible snarling noise. Lupin's head was lengthening. So was his body. His shoulders were hunching. His hair was sprouting visibly in the face, and his hands, which were now curling into clawed paws. Crookshank's hair was on end again. He was backing away. As the werewolf reared, snapping its long jaws, Sirius disappeared from Harry's side. He had transformed an enormous bear-like dog and bounded forward. As the werewolf wrenched itself free of the manacle binding it, the dog seized it about the neck and pulled it backwards, away from Ron and Pettigrew. They were backed jaw to jaw, clawing each other, ripping at each other. Harry stood transfixed by the sight, too intent upon the battle to notice anything else. It was Hermione's scream that alerted him. Pettigrew had dived for Lupin's dropped wand. Ron's unsteadily on his bandaged leg fell, and there was a bang and a burst of light. Ron lay motionless on the ground. Another bang. Crookshanks flew into the air, back on the earth in a heap. "Expelliarmus!" Harry yelled, pointing at his own wand, and Pettigrew, Lupin's wand, flew high into the air out of sight. "Stay where you are," Harry shouted, running forward. Too late. Pettigrew had transformed. Harry saw his bald tail whipping through the manacle of Ron's outstretched arm and headed scurrying through the grass. There was a low howl, or there was a howl and a rumbling growl. Harry turned to see the werewolf taking flight. It was galloping into the forest. "Sirius, he's gone. Pettigrew transformed," Harry yelled. Sirius was bleeding. There were gashes across his muzzle on his back. But at Harry's word, he scrambled up again, and in an instant the sound of his paws faded into the silence and pounded away across the grounds. Harry and Hermione dashed over to Ron. "What did he do to him?" Harry whispered. Ron's eyes were half closed. His mouth hung open. He was definitely alive. Could hear him breathing, but he didn't seem to recognize them. "I don't know." Harry looked desperately around. Black and Lupin both gone. They had no one but Snape for the company, still hanging unconscious in midair. "We'd better get them up to the castle and tell someone," said Harry, pushing his hair out of the eyes, trying to think straight. "Come." But then, from behind the range of the vision, they heard yelping and whining, a dog in pain. "Sirius," Harry muttered, staring into the darkness. He had a moment indecision, but then there was nothing they could do for Ron at the moment, and they had, by the sound of it, Black was in a bit of trouble. So Harry set off on a run, Hermione right behind him. Yelping seemed to be coming from near the lake. They pelted towards it, and Harry, running flat out, felt the cold without realizing what it meant. The yelping stopped abruptly. As they reached the lake shore, he saw why. Sirius had turned back into a man, and he was crouched on all fours and his hands over his head. "No," he moaned. "No, please." And Harry saw them, the Dementors. At least 100 of them, gliding back in the black mass around the lake towards them. He spun around, familiar icy cold penetrating his insides, fog staring at the obscure vision, more peering out of the dark on every side, and they were encircling them. "Hermione, think of something happy," Harry yelled, raising his wand, blinking furiously, trying to clear his vision, shaking his head to rid the faint screaming that he started to hear inside it. "I'm going to live with my godfather. I'm leaving the Dursleys." He forced himself to think of Sirius and only Sirius, and he began to chant, Expecto Patronum, Expecto Patronum." Black gave a shudder, yelled, he rolled over and lay motionless on the ground, pale as death. He'll be all right. I'm going to go live with him. Expecto Patronum. Hermione, help me. Expecto Patronum. Expecto, whispered. Expecto, expecto. But she couldn't do it. The Dementors were closing in, barely 10 feet away from them, and they formed a solid wall around Harry and Hermione. As they were getting closer, Expecto Patronum! Harry yelled, trying to blot the screaming from his ears. Expecto Patronum! Thin wisps of silver escaped his wand, lowering like a mist before him, and at that moment Harry felt Hermione collapse near him. He was alone, completely alone. Expecto! Expecto Patronum! Harry felt his knees hit the cold grass. His fog was clouding over his eyes. With a huge effort, he fought, remembering Sirius will be okay. I'm going to live with him. Expecto Patronum! He gasped. By the feeble light of the formless Patronus, he saw a Dementor halt very close to him. It couldn't walk through the cloud, and it slept of silver mist Harry had conjured. A dead, slimy hand slid out from under the cloak, and it made a gesture as though to sweep the Patronus aside. No, no, Harry gasped. He's innocent! Expecto Patronum! He could feel them watching him and hear their startling breath and evil around him. The nearest Dementor seemed to be considering him. Then it raised both rotting hands and lowered its hood, and there should have been eyes. There was only thin, gray, scabbed skin stretched blankly over the empty sockets, but there was a mouth, a gaping, shapeless hole, sucking the air with the sound of the death rattle. A paralyzing terror filled Harry, so he couldn't move or speak. His Patronus flickered and died. White fog was blinding them. He had to fight. Expecto Patronum! He couldn't see. In the distance he heard a familiar screaming. Expecto Patronum! He groped for the mist around Sirius and found his arm, but they weren't going to take him. But a pair of strong, clammy hands suddenly attached themselves around Harry's neck. They were forcing his face upward, and he could feel his breath. He was going to get rid of them first. He could feel it protrude. He could feel its putrid breath. His mother was screaming in his ears. He was going to be the last thing he ever heard, and then, though the fog was drowning him, he thought of the silver light growing brighter and brighter. He felt himself fall forward into the grass. Face down, too weak to move, sick and shaking, Hermione opened her eyes. Dementors must have released him. The blinding light was illuminating the grass around them. The screaming had stopped. The cold was ebbing away. Something was driving the Dementors back. It was circling them, and Sirius and Hermione, and the rattling and the sucking sounds of the Dementors were fading. They were leaving. The air was warm again. With every ounce of strength he could muster, Harry raised his head a few inches and saw an animal amid the light galloping away across the lake. Eyes blurred with sweat, Harry tried to make out what it was. It was as bright as a unicorn. Fighting to stay conscious, Harry watched it as the center to halt and reach the opposite shore. For a moment, Harry saw by his brightness somebody welcoming it back, raising its hand to pat it. Someone who looked strangely familiar. But who could it be? Harry didn't understand. He couldn't think any more. He felt the last of his strength leave him, and his head hit the ground as he fainted.